Is the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, and between 1952 and 62, Boeing built about 700 of these. Initially as a nuclear bomber during the Cold War years, they modified it to carry conventional ordnance and bombs. In Vietnam, they used them to bomb the jungles. And 8 big engines, a crew of 5, big bomb bay. Under the wings, you can see they could hang pylons for either 6 cruise missiles under each wing, or they could carry 12 big bombs under those conventional bombs. This particular airplane you're looking at here actually flew 16 combat missions during the first Gulf War. Folks, some of the B-52s would take off from Louisiana with their bomb load, with their cruise missile load, fly to Iraq, get their targets, launch their 20 missiles at different targets, and then fly back non-stop. I think the longest mission was 35 hours. Imagine being the Boeing KC-135 jet tanker. You can see under the tail the big refueling boom. Those 2 little wings on them, they'll release that, and with those wings they can control that boom as it's lower down underneath that tail, and they can line it up with an airplane that's flying formation right under the tail. And then the inside of it will extend out, and they'll engage in a door in the airplane and lock on, and that's how they transfer fuel. But that design, folks, goes back to the Eisenhower administration. That's how old it is.
50s.
And a couple of years ago, the Boeing company finally got a contract to build a replacement for it. So looks like we'll get a replacement. Helicopters on the left, you notice they don't storm with the rotors on there.
Yeah.
The heat and the sun would just deteriorate the composite material too much, so they're stored separately. You can see a lot of the airplanes, the trainers here.
Look how long it is. Look at how long those planes are.
The reason they keep them here is someplace in the world, somebody's flying a version of that aircraft, and they're here for the spare parts. Once they're no longer needed, they will chop them up. Coming up on the right, go straight here. Coming up on the right is a big maintenance bay where they do work on the aircraft. And then this building coming up is where all the orders for spare parts go around the world. And you can see an example of an F-16 on skids. This is the 2-place version, and it's going to be shipped off someplace. Somebody needs a replacement aircraft, and they'll package them up and ship them off on those big wooden skids there. A couple of years ago, they shipped out of there, I think it was last year, on average about 13,500 orders. Get out, and that kind of coats them. Now this airplane on the right over here, the big Boeing 747 with a white nose, is the Airborne Laser Test Program. And for years they were evaluating to see if they could take a big laser beam that's generated in that fuselage, a big chemical laser, and then they fire that beam out through the white nose there. It's a turret with mirrors in it, so they can aim it. And they wanted to see if they could destroy a missile in flight with just that laser beam.
Star Wars.
And about 3 years ago, they had a test program where that airplane actually shot out of the sky 2 ballistic missiles in their launch phase, tracking it with that laser, heating up the metal to where it actually failed. The only thing they're going to save on the airplane is the white nose, that turret, and the rest is kind of contaminated with all those nasty chemicals, so one day that'll be chopped up and disposed of. And when they put Cold Avenue through the facility here to connect the 2 sides of town, they put it underground so you can tow airplanes from one side to the other. Generally speaking, once they tow an airplane over that bridge, chances are pretty good it's not going to fly again. So if there is such a thing as a boneyard, we're in it now. Look at the extent they go through to get parts off of these KC-135 tankers. Prop them up on those big sawhorses so they can take landing gears out. There's that big air refueling probe sitting on the ground there, extended. The middle pipe extended on there. Second row back, you'll see an airplane, a WB-57. Look at the wingspan on that thing. That's a high-altitude weather reconnaissance airplane. They modified it with a huge sailplane wing, 122 feet, that wingspan from tip to tip. The Wright brothers' first flight was only 120 feet. A lot of the T-38 trainers here, and still in service. And you can look at these airplanes and see, well, they're all missing the rudder, so that, even the one we saw earlier is missing the rudder, so that's a high usage item. The landing gear, they'll take off. See, the F4s, they initially brought about 200 F4s in here just for spare parts. And I think there's still 5 countries that are flying the Fabulous, including the U.S. They use them for those drone programs. Coming up on the right are the B-1B Lancer bombers.
Awesome, awesome.
They've all been converted just to carry conventional weapons. They no longer are capable of carrying nukes. And still they're flown by the Air Combat Command in South Dakota and the Panhandle of Texas. And these are here just for spare parts. More of the F4s, and coming up on this field, you'll see the remaining handful of F-111 aircraft. A year ago, this field was solid full of them, and they've come in and made sure none of them have any hazardous material or pyrotechnics in there, and now they're going through and just crunching them up and hauling them off. Coming up on the right, you'll see some of the Lockheed C-5 Galaxies. Look at the size of that thing. That's the Air Force's biggest aircraft. Russians have one that's even bigger with 6 engines. It grosses over 1 million pounds. This guy's gross weight gross weight is 840,000 pounds. It can carry 2 of the big Army Abrams tanks in that. That's how much it can lift. There were 110 of them in service. With the budget cuts, they're taking about half of them out of service. So they're the ones that'll be in service, remaining in service right now, are all going to have new upgraded engines that are more fuel efficient, more powerful. And so we're going to have a lot of, about 50 of these C-5s around here. Off in the distance, you'll see some B-52 bombers that have been cut up into pieces as part of the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, where both Russia and the United States agreed to get rid of some of our long-range nuclear delivery capabilities. And when they cut those airplanes up, interestingly, they had to physically move the parts away from one another, so when the Russian satellite comes over and takes a picture, they can say, yep, they really did chop it up. The Russians were here 2 years ago, just about this time, as part of the START II treaty, the second treaty. And of course, they like to come here and inspect in the wintertime. We don't much like to go to Russia and inspect in the wintertime. Okay, on either side of the road here, you'll see manufacturing, tooling, and assembly jigs as they wanted. Air Force bought 220 of them, paid an average of $400,000 per airplane, and estimate they got $4 million worth of spare engines and spare parts. So it was a good win-win situation. Kind of the basic design of the KC-135. And again, you can see the extent they go through to get parts out of these airplanes to keep the existing fleet in. So they make some pretty good sized sawhorses here, don't they?
Yes.
Over on the right, coming up, you'll see 2 portable hangars. And in those hangars, as well behind them, you'll see a bunch of the Navy P-3 Orions. They're going in there and they're taking the wings off, and they're taking they're going to eventually package those so they can be hauled across country on flatbed trucks to, I think it's North Carolina, where they will be reassembled, refurbished, and they'll be used for sales to other countries around the world that are looking for a patrol bomber. The big, on the left side, those white containers there you see by the B-1s, those are auxiliary fuel tanks that go up inside of one of the 3 bomb bays to give them more gas carrying capability. But again, airplanes are here just for spare parts. And way off in the distance, they're starting to put some more C-5s back there. A year ago, there were a dozen of the early C-5As there that were here just for spare parts. And once this new, all the rest of them came, last year they went and chopped all those things up. It took about a month of squeezing parts out of each one to get them reduced to some metal they could put on flatbed trailers. Well, we're coming back over to the bridge here. When they put that in, they constructed it to carry the empty weight of the B-52, which was the heaviest airplane here at the time. And then along comes the C-5 Galaxies, which weighed over 2 times the empty weight of the B-52. So when they towed the first Galaxy over here, they had the sheriff come and block off the road in case the bridge didn't stand up. A lot of interesting airplanes back there. Every year they'll take the docents and we'll go back, and I think there's still about 6 Soviet MiG fighters back there. Now, what do you suppose we're doing with MiG fighters?
I suppose we're studying
Well,
them.
about 5 years ago, the Air Force finally acknowledged to everyone that for a long period of time they did have a secret squadron in the desert north of Las Vegas that flew MiGs, called the Red Hats. Had no better way to learn how to fly against a MiG than to fly against a MiG. See how good they really were.
The airplane was hit 4 times in combat. If you look at the center portion of the vertical stabilizer back there, you'll see the patch with the big red 1 on it. That is the patch of the Army's 1st Division, the so-called Big Red 1. Now, right behind this airplane, there's a gray-on-gray camouflage airplane. 02 on the nose. It's an OB-10 Bronco. Broncos were used by the Navy, by the Marines, and by the Air Force over there in Vietnam, primarily as forward air control types of aircraft. If you look along the side of the belly as you go back there,